Firstly, I'd like to say a massive thank you to HCC for the opportunity to visit Australia, to look into the concept of breeding sheep for better resistance to worms. I'd also like to thank my family and friends for the support and encouragement to apply and throughout the scholarship process, as well as all those that put me in touch with contact and helped me arrange visits. So why Australia? Apart from the obvious attraction of hot weather in November, I decided to travel to Australia because they have a large breeding flock where performance recording on stud flocks is commonly undertaken. As well as this, resistance is known to be a particular issue in the Merino breed because they are less able to deal with the worm burden and so are wormed more regularly and have therefore built up a resistance to the wormers. So I travelled to Australia with a question: can breeding sheep for low worm burdens be a tool to preventing resistance to drenches here in the UK? I was also interested to see how they manage larger properties and farms, as well as large numbers of sheep. So I found it quite difficult to summarise the trip because I visited 18 different farms and saw many different people with different ideas. But during the 4 weeks of travel, I drove 5,500 kilometres and visited 18 farms and a sale yards. I landed in Melbourne and headed towards Adelaide before driving back on myself towards Sydney. And then around the Wagga area there towards Sydney was where a lot of the farms were visited. So all performance recorded sheep in Australia are recorded through the Sheep Genetics Australia program. Each sheep is put into one of the following categories: maternal, terminal, and merino. And each animal within those categories is directly comparable across different breeds and flocks within that category. So for example, as a commercial farmer buying a terminal sire, you would be able to compare a Suffolk ram from flock A with a Poll Dorset ram for flock B. I think this gives the performance recording genetics a lot of strength, and it gives the farmers out there a lot of faith in when they're buying these sheep, they know exactly what they're going to deliver for their systems. So how do they go about breeding for better resistance to worms? So between the age of weaning, which would be about 12 weeks old, and a year old, each lamb that is retained for breeding are left undrenched for a prolonged period to allow the bulk worm egg sample to increase to 300 to 500 eggs per gram. With the bulk sample at 500 eggs per gram, some ram lambs will have individual results of up to 3,000 eggs per gram or even higher, and some will be there at 0. So this information is then fed into the system, and this is what forms the animal's worm egg count score on the EBVs. So the first visit was to John Keeler at Cashmore Oakley. John had a real passion for breeding animals and has been performance recording his sheep flock for 30 years. At Cashmore, they now tag 8,200 lambs at birth and then fully performance record those animals right through to sale or slaughter. They breed lines of maternal composites, which would be quite similar to some of the stuff that Derry's doing with Innovus. And also there's a lot of different people in the UK breeding them. Terminal sires and nudies, which are his version of the wool shedding sheep. As well as a sheep flock, it was really interesting to see John's herd of twinning cows, which is one of only a handful of twinning cows in the herds of twinning cows in the world. And last year they scanned at 130%. So the 44 decisions. So John asked me how long I intended farming for, and I said, well, I'm 26 now, maybe till I'm 70, so 44 years. And he replied, well, you only have to make 44 decisions that will influence the genetic direction of your flock. He said, are you going to do that using genetic data, or are you going to just go and have a look at which animal looks nice on the day of sale? Next, I visited Tim Lehman at Paradu Prime. There they're breeding maternal composite rams in quite a low rainfall area. Tim was very focused on labour efficiency and had invested in state-of-the-art handling facilities with a long race bulk handler installed. He also had quite a different take on tupping ewe lambs, where he tucked them in containment feeding yards, which is shown there in the middle picture. And he was getting conception rates of 80 or 90%, and they were scanning around 140% as ewe lambs. His quote is that he needs to be able to drive around his farm at 60 kilometers an hour, and so the farm tracks were very, very well maintained. Next, I visited Sammy McIntyre, who's a commercial sheep farmer near Adelaide. They had a metre of rainfall annually, which is only 40 mil less than we have here at home in Brecon, but their rain would come all in 4 months, really. She's been moving away from buying first cross ewes to breeding her own replacements, and is very interested in buying. So she's buying Cashmore Oakley genetics that have low worm egg counts because she's worried about developing resistance to drench on her farm. She's also recently visited the UK to complete her Nuffield scholarship, looking at different feedlot systems for lambs. Then visited Jamie Heinrich on Kangaroo Island. Jamie's granddad founded the White Suffolk, so they really liked the terminal traits that the Suffolk gave them, but the black wool coming into what was then quite expensive was contaminating their expensive white wool. So he crossed a Poll Dorset with a Suffolk to breed an animal that was not going to have black wool. And so it's been a very popular terminal sire out there. And they now sell White Suffolk and maternal composite and merino rams. I was kind of blown away by the level of biosecurity at the Heinrichs farm, where we had to chain where their wellies to go around the farm because they were so worried about contamination of foot rot being brought onto the farm. Ellen Arney at Inverbrachy, so they were breeding Border Leicester ram lambs, or rams as a stud flock. They had just 380 mil of rain a year, and all came between May and September. In that bottom picture, you can see lambs that were grazing, standing wheat crop, which is quite a sight to see. And they've been, along with Mark Ferguson of Next Gen Agri, have been developing an artificial intelligence system of scoring the ram lambs. So they go into a crate, and then there's cameras looking at the structure of their feet and legs. Because that was one area that they felt was still up to human, could still be influenced by human decision rather than numbers. Then I saw something completely different. Saw Emma, Peter, Lisa McCrabb, and they were running a 35,000 acre property, running 7,000 merino ewes in quite harsh conditions, where they used 2 planes for mustering. They were breeding their own ram lambs, which were scored for wrinkle at marking time and a year old, where they were breeding non-mules sheep, which I'll explain a little bit later on. They also had a shear farming operation in New South Wales, where they ran cattle with a friend on 100,000 acres up there, which I don't know, I couldn't quite get my head around the scale of that. Then visited Wagga Sale Yards, where they sold 55,000 sheep on the day that I visited, but that was kind of their usual weekly sale there. And the sale included 12,000 cull ewes and 43,000 lambs. At the time, the lamb trade in Australia was really poor for the farmers, and 65 kilo lambs were making just £75. Which didn't seem much really for the size of what they were producing, and cull ewes were basically given away. I visited Justin Roberts, who is another commercial farmer, farming 3,000 acres over 2 properties, where one block was mainly permanent pasture and the other block was cropping and lucerne. And he believed that lucerne was an integral part to his finishing system, and he even said if he couldn't grow lucerne, he probably wouldn't bother farming. He runs 3,000 self-replacing maternal composite ewes, and he had quite a neat system of clean grazing where he'd have cattle in on his finishing block on what they call adjustment, which is tack, and then they'd be moved off that block in time for the Lucerne to recover. He'd then wean his fat lambs from his permanent pasture block down into a clean environment, into the Lucerne, where they would grow on and finish. And he saw this as a real way of reducing the amount of drench that was going into his lambs through clean grazing. And he had an extremely strict culling policy, which had led to a more resilient flock. Events were something completely different. Jacob Walke was direct selling meat. His family had a non-farming background and used to sell CDs, but when streaming became a thing, that kind of the business didn't really work anymore. So he also had children at the time, and decided that he couldn't find any meat that he was happy to feed his children. So he decided to try and farm regeneratively, and just so he started off with cattle, shedding sheep, saddleback pigs, broiler chickens, and laying hens. And what his system was quite different is he had a 24/7 butchery, where you could only get into the butchery if you were a member, and you could only be a member if you visited the farm and listened to his story. And then once you're inside the butchery, there's nobody around, there's a few cameras, and you just pick up an item of meat from the freezer, scan it on your phone and pay for it, and walk out without any interaction with a human, because he did the figures and it basically didn't add up if he had to employ somebody to stand behind the counter. He also had the Nguni cattle, which are from South Africa, and he's aiming for a 200 kilo carcass, because he was finishing Hereford cross cattle, but he couldn't get any butchers to last because the weight of the animals was too great. Their bodies were giving in, he said. I also visited some large merino stud flocks, Pudgenook and Mumblebone, and they were both breeding non-mulesed sheep. So in Australia, merinos have been traditionally bred to have plenty of wrinkles, which allowed for more high quality wool to be grown on the same animal. So in doing so, a wrinkle is formed above the tail, and in this wrinkle, the blow quite commonly would be attacked by blowfly. So they started mulesing, which is a process of cutting the skin right around the tail to stop the blowfly from happening in that area. But as a result, many people view it as a cruel process. So now a lot of these forward-thinking merino studs are breeding them plainer bodied, which would be more like the sheep that we'd farm here in the UK, where they wouldn't have that wrinkle. So that seemed to be a main focus for them out there, as well as lowering the worm egg counts, because of what I mentioned earlier, that merinos are quite susceptible to worms and don't deal with them very well. So that was a priority on many of these farms. And Mumblebone kind of come into the merino stud breeding world differently, and have tried to build a sheep that kind of is focused on growth and fertility rather than wool. So they probably have a 19 micron fleece rather than a 17, 18, but they'd have much better growth and fertility in their sheep than maybe some of the other more extreme merino studs. I also visited some beef farms, two very different systems. Michael Gooden was running grass-based Angus genetics from Kip Fearer in America, very small, compact cows, and he was using a flood irrigation system to extend the grazing season. And then John Wright was breeding short-horn cross Angus cows, and a heavy focus on feed efficiency for the past 20 years. And he was bulling heifers at 15 months, regardless of weight. And some were as light as 250 kilos, which I saw when I was out there. And they did seem quite small. But he assures me that they grow to the cows in the picture above, and there was no problem calving them. And he tags and weighs 500 calves at birth annually. So a few trials that I came across whilst I was in Australia was the wool loss through protein injection trial, where so that they're trying to find innovative ways to eradicate the need for shearing, because it's getting more and more difficult to find shearers and more expensive to find them. So the process would work by injecting the sheep, and then they'd run them down a race. And I think this is the bit they haven't quite worked out properly. The wool will fall off, but they need a system of harvesting the wool through brushes, or I'm not sure quite how that's going to work yet, but it'll be interesting to see where that goes. And on Kangaroo Island, where Jamie Heinrich was farming, they were planning to release a sterile fly that was going to kill the blowfly on the island. And so that would mean that there would be no or a far reduced risk of maggots in the sheep. So I've across all of the farms, there was some very impressive infrastructure, laneways connecting all fields. Investment in sheep handling seemed to be very paramount to attract and keep good staff. Confinement feeding systems were popular so that sheep could be shut in them whilst there was long periods of no rain. To save the rest of the pasture, so that when it did rain, it bounced back straight away. And then in that bottom right picture is a Pro-Way bulk sheep handler, which I thought was brilliant, with the sheep walking to the race, and then they get lifted just a little bit off the ground so they can't move, and then you go along and drench or inject or whatever you need to do to the sheep without any fighting them. So in general, what I noticed about sheep farming in Australia, that scale allowed for better labour efficiency. So they were running much higher stocking rates per labour unit than we'd ever be able to do in this country. And I think a lot of that's because their farms were usually in one block, so they could have one set of yards and you could walk sheep. Whereas in this country, as people have expanded, there's blocks of land everywhere, which makes things quite inefficient, really. If you're looking at a labour efficiency point of view. In general, people talked about careers in farming, which I hadn't really, it isn't really mentioned so much in this country. Like farming, isn't in school and stuff. You wouldn't be like, I'm going to take a career in farming. Probably a little bit more professional out there, but that's probably to do with the larger farms. And they seem a lot less tied to their land and their systems, and are happy to change or sell the farm and move to a completely different area if they think that there's a better opportunity to make money in that area. They're definitely not as focused on an animal's appearance and are more in tune with using data to make decisions. And in general, they had a very positive outlook for the future of ag, which was hard to believe really when you saw how little they were getting for the lambs at the time. But they were the people that I spoke to were very positive about the future, and it's a big part, like sheep farming and farming in general is a big part of Australia's economy. However, since coming home, I have been reading that live export of sheep from Western Australia, or in general, has been banned, but this is going to have a dramatic effect on the economy in Western Australia, because a lot of the lambs from there would have been live exported to the Middle East. So that's bad news for those Western Australian sheep farmers. So take-home messages. So stud breeders had a big focus on resilience traits, which included reducing the amount of dags on sheep, improving feet structure and leg scores, and then reduced worm egg counts. All of this would lead to more resilient sheep for their customers. I think there's big opportunity for this to be replicated in the UK. And I know some breeders are already doing this. I think there's Clean's been bred in North Wales. I think Romney's been bred with Matt Smith down in Dorset. X-Liners with Tim White, and I'm sure there's many more. But I think they've been bred for better resilience rather than resistance, which is a slightly different thing. I think that there is real power in the Australian sheep genetics database system, and it definitely gives farmers a lot of confidence when they're buying those sheep that they are going to do exactly what they say. And yeah, I'm just really extremely grateful for the opportunity to travel, and I've met some very inspiring and kind people, which I would like to thank very much. So thank you very much for listening.